will, and the will comes up out of the physical body. So that, let's say, the difference between these three is, let's say, I'm looking at the outer world and I'm perceiving things with my sort of sentient soul. And let's say I turn away from that and I start thinking about what it was I was perceiving. Now I'm using the mind soul. And then let's say that after I've thought about it, I decide that I'm going to act on things. Now we're in the consciousness soul. So the consciousness soul brings the will into effect that acts on the data given to the senses. So the consciousness soul has more to do with the will, and it has to do with freedom. And Northern European civilization has really developed this sense of freedom and free will. And this is why I think astrology dropped away. Because the early version of astrology was too deterministic. The astrological vision that we inherited from the ancients was a very deterministic system, although there were ways of breaking out of it. And in fact, the old initiation mysteries consisted in gaining freedom from the stars through initiation in the mystery cults. But I think astrology dropped out because of this emphasis on this new, aggressive, Faustian freedom and the sort of conquest of the earth with our machines. We didn't want any stars telling us what to do. So now as astrology returns, and it is returning, we have to sort of reflect upon how does this work with respect to freedom of the will. And in Steiner, actually, the sort of dichotomy is, although he doesn't have astrology, he has karma. And he has this karma thing. He has, on the one hand, this emphasis on freedom, but on the other, there's this karma that you've inherited from your past life. So you have the same tension that we would have with respect to astrology versus, say, free will. You're dealing with limitations in life, always. And the limitations are what provide you with the sort of incentive to move on, to accomplish things. So that's the sort of Steiner's model of the architecture of the subtle body. And it's now, of course, that doesn't clarify what we mean by these upper three. And I can't get too much into that except to say that the spirit body is the sublimation of the physical body, the life spirit of the etheric body, spirit self. Okay, so spirit self is something that can be developed through exercises which he terms imagination. Now, he says, let's say you decide you want to go onto the spiritual path and you want to start the process. He says the first thing you're going to want to develop is the ego wants to start work on the astral body. That's the first thing. It's the easiest to do. And the way in which it does that is through imagination. This is very close to the Jungian individuation process. And it has simply to do with contemplation of images. And the images have to be contemplated in a certain way, though. And for example, he gives a couple of exercises where he says, let's say, the first thing, what you really want to do in order to attain knowledge of the higher worlds is you want to learn how to disengage your mind from your senses. You have to be able to hold the soul out of its immersion in the body so that you don't take everything you see at face value. But he says there's a gradual training process for doing this, and he starts with like the most basic exercise, and he says, imagine a seed. Just imagine in your palm that there's a plant seed there. Now, what's within that plant seed? The entire future history of that plant is in that seed, but you can't see it. It's in there, but you can't see it. You know that if you put the seed into the ground and give it what it needs, it will generate a plant in time. You know all of that, but your senses don't tell you that. Your mind tells you that. If you were to put a copy of the seed that was a fake seed next to that seed, as far as your senses could tell, the two are absolutely identical. But your mind knows that in the true seed, there's going to be a real plant that comes out of that. So your mind can access knowledge that is not available to your senses. And he says that's sort of basic exercise number one, is to train your mind to think in this way to be able to see into the invisible forces that are at work in the world. And he always gives these sort of, anything to do with plants is etheric. He always gives you these sort of etheric exercises, meditating on the plant world to sort of begin. Like he'll talk about also meditate upon, the formation of a rose. What happens there? Well, this sort of rose comes up out of the ground, and these green juices come up, and they ascend, and they're refined into this red sap. And the red sap sort of produces this beautiful redness of this rose. And he says, what's happening there? Well, if you notice what's happening is these lower, this actually almost presupposes a knowledge of Goethe's metamorphosis of plants, but Goethe's theory was that the lower juices in a plant are gradually refined as the plant ascends and grows, it gets more and more sublimated, and it refines these juices, and it sort of gets rid of the lower juices by putting out stem leaves, and the stem leaves take up these excess nourishments, and finally, the more refined the juices are as they ascend up, the more refined they become, and they're used for the formation of the spiritual part of the plant, the blossom, the corolla. And he says, that all sort of takes place without any passion. There's no real struggle. Plants don't have an astral body. There's no, if you compare that with what happens in a human being is racked with passions and desires and the whole sexual problem and the maturation problem. And there are all these lower forces at work which are much more difficult to harness. But he says that the human being, notice, possesses something that the plant doesn't have. Though the plant has this process that unfolds naturally, the human being has these upper faculties of spirit, which the plant doesn't have. So the human being, though there are more things that can go wrong in the development of the human being, can also attain to a level of consciousness that is far greater than anything that can ever develop out of the plant world. So he says, just sort of imagine this. Imagine the analogy, imagine this sort of cross, and imagine that it's a black cross, and the cross is, this is actually the Rosicrucian meditation, and the black cross corresponds to the lower passions in the human being. And then he says, imagine these sort of red roses germinating, 7 of them in a circle out of that cross, and you'll have an idea of what we mean in this spiritual model of the sublimation of these sort of lower energies into these higher, upper spiritual energies within the human being. But the point is, I almost don't understand what he means there, but the point about it is, imaginative exercises have to do with the contemplation of mental images, or you can, draw them out, or however you want to do it. But the point is to begin to train your mind to think in a spiritual way, and anybody can learn how to do this just by meditating on, processes that we normally see every day, the growth of plants and animals, just think about these mundane things in a way that enables you to see that there are these invisible forces at work behind these phenomena, and you'll be on the way to the development and cultivation of the spirit self, which will then gradually come into maturity. I think that sounds a lot like the Jungian individuation process, which has to do with the activation of the imagination, getting the imagination activated and projecting out the contents of the unconscious into, a painting or a drawing or art. That's what the soul wants. It's naturally, inherently creative, and it wants that engagement with images. So the astral has to do with images in one form or another. Remember, animals have the astral body and they have dreaming consciousness, so there's that imagistic element that's common to both the astral and the spirit self. When you move into the life spirit, this is much harder to do because now you're not just sort of gaining control of your passions and desires, which, as we've said, happens normally anyway, generally through the maturation process, ideally. But what you want to change now, what you want to get down into are the deep-seated character traits, and those are much harder to change. Habits, the reprogramming of long-term habits, like let's say you're alcoholic and you want to reprogram that. It's really hard to do, until you've fallen all the way down and have messed up your life, your job, ruined your marriage. You get this accumulation of noise before you get this buildup such that your life is ready for the sudden transformation. The etheric body is really hard to change just by the sort of day-to-day basis. So you have to sort of work into the etheric body, and I'm not sure how that works. He calls this inspiration rather than imagination. And now it involves, as soon as you bring in inspiration, by inspiration he means inspiration from the divine beings. So now you're beginning to relate. You're not just sort of contemplating mental images. You're beginning to relate now to the spiritual world. You're beginning to communicate with it. And inspirations have more to do with sound than they do with image. So that with imagination we have sort of pictures, and with inspiration we have to do more with sound, namely the harmony of the cosmic spheres. This has to do with the hearing of a kind of cosmic music that inspires you such that you can begin to see the cosmic interrelationships between all things, how these cosmic beings are involved in all of these great life processes. And this will bring about the change in the religious orientation, which is also linked with the etheric body. This brings this sort of religious consciousness into being now. That's linked with the etheric body. And then eventually you have the spirit body, which he says is developed through what he calls intuition. And so we have imagination, inspiration, and intuition. And you can't have knowledge of past lives until you've moved into this stage of intuition.